Thank you very much, Joe. Is it working? Can you hear me? Perfect. Great. Okay, so first of all, thank you for choosing this session over the other. It's a pleasure having you here today. I'm very excited to be on the stage today because it's the first time that I'm delivering this talk. And to be honest, it's also very challenging because I'm trying to summarize in 2 years of work in 30 minutes. That is really interesting. So today I want to introduce you on my vision of Microfrontend's architecture. It's not a new topic. But there are many approaches that we can have. I would like to give you mine. As Joe said, my name is Luca. I'm Chief Architect at DAZN. DAZN is an OTT platform. It's available in 7 countries. We already have hundreds of developers. We have millions of customers. It's a really interesting challenge because we have 30 devices that we have to keep on track and deliver our applications. We have a video delivery pipeline that's very complex. It's basically the Netflix for sport. I'm a Google developer expert on web technologies, and I'm organizing in London a lot of meetups with my community. So if you are in London and you're looking for a meetup, usually we organize one per month. So feel free to join us. So what we are going to cover today. So first of all, we will do a journey from a monolith to micro anything. And then we were talking about what is a microfrontend. We will define some principles around them, and we will end up with some technical implementation or, let's say, different option that we can have in order to embrace this new architecture. First of all and foremost, obviously this one is, as I said, the first time that I do this talk, but in order to arrive to these ideas and concept, I had to be very open-minded and questioning all the best software developer practices that I studied in the past. So please be open-minded during this talk and think at scale, because this is one of the ways that you will embrace better this architecture. Okay, so I joined DAZN 3 years ago. We started. We are still a startup in a certain way, despite the number of people that are working on DAZN. And I remember one of the first day that I was there, and the CPO came to my desk and said, "Listen, Luca, I know that you are the second tech person that was hired inside this company, but at the same time, I would like that you think broadly and you start to think at scale, because what we would like to have in DAZN is having hundreds of developers that are working on the same platform and the same code base." And to be honest, in a certain way, as an architect, I was a bit scared, because if you think about that, you are the second that joined the company as a tech person, and suddenly you discover that you already have this huge challenge to think about an architecture that could empower developers, distributed teams across the world working on the same code base. So it's a big challenge. So bear that in mind, let's start to this journey that was basically the journey that I did in order to move forward towards the micro world, as I call it. So when we start, usually when you start a new project, or if you work in a startup, usually what you really care about at the beginning is retrieving quickly a feedback from your potential customers, right? So the tech stack is important, but not essential. What you do is you tend to, obviously, time to market is more important, therefore you tend to maybe cut some corners, but usually 90% of the time, what you end up having is, I'd say, a database that is shared across multiple APIs. You have an API layer that is storing what they call a monolith that basically contains all your APIs, integration with third-party companies, and so on. And then on the client side, you have a single-page application. Single-page application, I picked that architecture just because obviously there are several others that you can pick. It could be server-side rendered. You can have single pages. But single-page application is one of the most used, where you download the entire code base, and basically then you just consume some APIs in order to view the rendering, render the view. And then when you validate your ideas and the company starts to grow, you identify what are the areas that has to grow with the company and the organization. So what you start to do is taking your monolith, breaking it up in multiple microservices. You start to have one database for microservices, because otherwise it's an anti-pattern using a shared database for multiple microservices. You have your infrastructure that is dedicated for that, and then you start to divide your teams following, let's say, the way how the business works. But what do you do on the client side? On the client, usually what you have is, I don't know, tens of developers that are working on the same code base, how they started, and it's becoming more difficult every time, every iteration, because if they're not very prescriptive in the way that they are working, you risk to have let's say, a code base that is exploding, and it's way more difficult if you start to have distributed teams. Because with distributed teams, it's very, very hard, apart from having pull requests, that you can check what is the outcome of your code base. So the impact with your team. So usually on the front-end side, as we said, we have a unique code base that is managed by multiple teams. What we need to manage a lot is the communication overhead between different parts of the organization, and particularly if you have a distributed team. Instead, if you check what is happening on the infrastructure side, so DevOps side and backend side, they start to have a structure that allow them to scale independently some part. They have some strong boundaries around what they are delivering, and everything becomes easier in a certain way, because if they design properly their microservice and their APIs, they just define a contract and they stick with that, and then they are completely autonomous to deliver a new microservice, a new version. There are a lot of engineering practices that you can use in order to ensure that your microservice is not breaking up the entire platform, also in production. So a lot of these things, but on the client side, it wasn't exactly the same things, right? So as we said, this is our situation, and I would like that you stick that in mind, because this is how often these kind of things are working. But what if we change this thing? What if we start to take the principles of microservices and apply to the client side? What if we start to say, okay, so domain-driven design is not only for the backend. It could be applied also on the front end. At the end of the day, if you think about that, we have a monolith, we break it apart, and we start to have multiple APIs that are managed by multiple containers, or I don't know, lambdas, or whatever you prefer to deal with. And then you start to have, let's say, an infrastructure that is dedicated for certain microservice, and you can have also on the front end. You can break apart the SPA monolith, having, let's say, some challenges, obviously, because obviously you need to find a way to orchestrate which client, which microfrontend you want to load. But at the end of the day, you can do that. And you can end up on something, on an architecture like that. Obviously, it's a simplification, but why not? So if we let's say, start to dig in a little bit further with that, we can start to see something very interesting. So first of all, the impact to the team. Because we don't think often as architects or too much on the process of how we structure the team, but we have to do that. Because if you want to scale your company, that is probably one of the most important things, in particular for the front end. If you scale the front end, you don't have to scale infrastructure, because we are delivering vast majority of the time static files. So CDNs are doing that for us. What we need to scale and think about that are the teams, because that is the complicated part. But with Microfrontends, we can start to introduce a way to speed up the throughput of our teams, because we can have cross-functional teams that are managing the API layer, the infrastructure layer, and the front-end layer in autonomy. They don't have to, let's say, communicate with other teams as long as the contracts are respected. They start to have freedom and responsibility because they own the full stack end-to-end for the first time. They can innovate. As we know, one of the pleasure of working with microservices is the fact that you can have multiple technology stack when you are designing your APIs. We can do the same on microfrontends. Why you cannot have, like, I don't know, part of your application written in Vue.js and part with React and Redux and part with Angular? It's totally feasible. So let's talk about what is a microfrontend now. So this is my definition. Obviously, you cannot find much on the web, so I'm working hard in order to provide some information. So starting from a DDD perspective, microfrontends are a technical representation of a business domain, subdomain. And they provide strong boundaries with clear contracts, and they avoid sharing logic with other subdomains. That, for me, is, let's say, a definition that is providing clarity on what we are trying to achieve with microfrontends. I would like to check the key part of this sentence. So, representation of business subdomain with strong boundaries and clear contracts, and avoid sharing logic. So, domain and subdomains is not a new concept. It's something that is applied in domain-driven design for a while. And often, domain-driven design is thought mainly for backend layers, but we should do use also on the front end. So let's see what is a domain. A domain is the problem to be addressed with the software effort. So if you think about Netflix, I hope that everyone knows what Netflix is. The domain for them is an OTT platform that is trying to deliver movies with streaming, okay? But obviously, if we take all this domain all together, it's very complex because there are a lot of things inside there. We have to think about subscription, payment, catalog, and so on. And therefore, DDD is tending to say, okay, so if we have a domain, you can split it up in multiple subdomains. And usually, if you do that very well and you master the domain, you can start to map your subdomains also with teams. And that is very important because obviously you can start to have, I don't know, the payment team, and you have like your infrastructure team and your front-end and back-end team and the cross-functional team working together with the product. And that is something very, very important because when you have that, it means that the communication overhead starts to diminish a lot. Another key concept of microfrontends for me is share nothing. And I know that is very painful at the beginning because the first thing that we tend to do on the front end is, okay, so I have to create my application. There are some components that are available in multiple areas of my application. Let's create a component library. And trust me, I spend a lot of time working with, on this topic with developers, and I know what are the pros and cons of this. I know that there is a lot of resistance at the beginning. But the fact that you are, so if you think about a microservice, usually with a microservice, you share really a little bit, that usually are logs and monitoring, and often are not even inside your code. What if we can do the same on the front end? Honestly, what we have done, so one of the things that usually we have in DAZN, a lot of people are saying, okay, we have multiple microfrontends, and we have the header and footer that are replicated, I don't know, 5, 6 times. Copy and paste and then change. And a lot of people are saying, oh yes, but that is a bad practice because we are copying code and every time we need to change 5 times. But the question is, how often the header and footer is changing during the life cycle of a platform? So I checked that thing, and we changed twice in 3 years. So is it really a problem, the fact that we are adding a new, I don't know, label inside the header, or we are changing the color of the font? I don't think so. I think that the throughput is way more important than thinking on, okay, we have to deal with this duplication of code. And if it's well addressed, it's not a big deal. So how we can approach microfrontends? Because there are several ways to do that. It's not, as I said, it's not a new concept, but we are trying to find the right way to do that. So for instance, Spotify in the desktop application, they work with iframes. It's a desktop application that is based on web technologies for the UI and the C++ behind the scene. And what they are doing basically are creating multiple iframes that are their microfrontends. And inside the view, there is, I don't know, the microfrontend for the music player. They have, I don't know, what your friends are listening. There is the list, the catalog, microfrontend, and so on. And they're communicating together via an event bus that is injecting inside microfrontend. That is one option. Obviously, the question here is how we can let's say, assemble these views in a proper way. Probably there is another team that is doing that. Probably there is a responsibility of a specific team, but still there is a lot of communication that is going on. OpenTable, another large organization, they have distributed teams in Australia, London, and San Francisco, if I remember well. They created so they started this journey of microfrontends in 2014, if I remember well. And they basically created a developer experience team that deliver these open components as an open source project, where basically when we define a component is front-end, back-end, and style and everything, server-side rendered component that is stored inside the registry. Think about Docker if you're familiar with that. And each single team can pick up from this registry the components that they want, and they compose their application without much communication at the end, because if there is a team in Australia that is creating, I don't know, the header, then it could be used anywhere else. Obviously, there is some coordination that has to happen on this side, across region, but at the end, it's really an interesting approach. And this is another approach for microfrontends as well. Obviously, for making smoother the experience for developers, they created also a CLI. But that means at the same time that a new joiner in OpenTable has to learn all these things and start to use all the tools that are available inside the company. The third example, that is the one that is closer to my ideas, is Zalando. This is fashion e-commerce. And several years ago, I attended to a talk made by one of their engineers. And the interesting bit there is that they basically created an open source framework called Mosaic. There is a specific part called Tailor.js. And what Tailor does is basically created a runtime your pages. Basically, there is a tiny layer that every time you request a page, they are assembled HTML fragments on the go. Obviously, they are highly cacheable because when you have, like, I don't know, a tracksuit from Adidas, it will be always that. You don't have to serve something specific. But in that case, they can do that. They can work at scale. They produce these pages. They cache on the CDN, and that's it. The Tailor is written in Go. It was one of the first experiments that I saw pretty brilliant for front-end written in Go. They were inspired by BigPipe from Facebook, so you can see BigPipe on Facebook pages. It's more or less similar, but also in this case, we are talking about components that are assembled at runtime on the server. We took a different approach in this case, because one thing that I was thinking when I was designing this architecture is, okay, so now we have like a small team of developers that are working on one platform that is web, but we need to target 30 platforms. We need also to have distributed teams that are sharing the same code base because they have to work on the same code base. And who knows what could happen next? So the first thing that I did, I take our application that, if you think about Netflix, is very similar, and I work with the domains. So I started to slice and dice my application in multiple subdomains. So we have the landing page subdomain, we have the authentication that contains sign in, sign up, retrieve email, retrieve password, payment, all together. We have discovery and playback, where we have basically the core of DAZN, where we have a catalog, we have a search functionality, we have a schedule functionality, and we have the playback. Then we have the customer support, where we have the help and the chat, the contact us, and so on. And we have my account, where you can basically change a few of the things. So those are let's say, the key domains that subdomains that we have inside the DAZN domain. And those are mapped one-to-one with our product team. So we have a product team that is managing payment. We have a product team that is managing, I don't know, the acquisition. We have a product team for managing the landing page. Sometimes the product team is composed by one person only. Sometimes it's, let's say, composed by more people. Discovery and playback is pretty huge, for instance. But this is how we structure the things. And each single of these areas are represented, in technically speaking, with a single page application. So each of them is a single page application. Some of them, they are not even sharing the same technology stack. Some of them are based on React and MobX, some other just React. We are doing some tests with other technologies, but all of them are completely different projects, managed by different teams. And in order to orchestrate this, because the complexity of this is not creating multiple single-page applications, it's how we deliver to the client. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that. And at the end, what I came up from, in order to avoid scalability issues, because the problem that we have compared to Zalando is we need to create something that is highly scalable, that is completely customized for the user. Therefore, we cannot use too much the CDN right now for serving our content because there are too many permutations. So I created this layer that is called the Bootstrap. And it's the first thing that is downloaded when you type www.dazn.com. And what it does is it has like just few things that it has to do. So the first thing is doing the application startup. So it's just understanding in which platform the user is watching DAZN and retrieving the configuration for that specific country. Then is abstracting the input-output operation for all the other single-page application or microfrontends. Because one of the problems that you have when you work on TVs in particular is that the API for writing something on the operating system are completely different between manufacturer, or in the same manufacturer between different smart TVs editions. So if you have Samsung or Sai and Samsung DAZN, there are completely different APIs to write that. So therefore, if each single Microfrontend should know this kind of permutation, it means that we need to create one for each single platform. But honestly, we can abstract that. And the Bootstrap is doing this. The other thing is doing the routing between microfrontends. So he understands in which state the user is, and then based on that is retrieving the right microfrontend. So you understand if the user is signed in, and if he's signed in, it will go straight to the delivering playback. If he's not signed in, it will instead serve the landing page, unless there is a deep link. In that case, it's going to the authentication page, for instance. The last thing is sharing configuration across multiple microfrontends. So in that case, because it's a vanilla JavaScript layer that is just exposing some stuff, we are just exposing things that are happening in one microfrontend and making available for other microfrontends to listen to that. Also, for instance, I don't know, marketing pixel or analytics like Google Tag Manager, stuff like that, are living inside the Bootstrap. And the Bootstrap is the key of our strategy, because obviously, if you think about that, we need to deliver around 20 smart TVs application. And if I start to have, like, let's say, a specific code, domain-specific code inside each single microfrontend, therefore, it's impossible for us, because we need to have so much effort in order to make it right that it's very difficult. Instead, if I abstract that on the Bootstrap, it's very interesting, because it became very natural. I can reuse authentication everywhere without changing anything. The other interesting thing of this is that we can do, on the delivery side, we can do something that is unique, right? Because we can, for instance, maintain the current application and deliver just a subset of the functionality of this new architecture without impacting the user. So potentially, we can say 30% of our users are receiving the discovery and playback microfrontend instead of the previous application that is a single-page application. But at the same time, I can reuse all the rest for maintaining the authentication, landing pages, stuff like that. So this architecture allows us to deploy wherever we want, when we want, in a specific country, and ease gradually the new version of a microfrontend, like we can do with microservices. If you think about, I don't know, blue-green deployment or canary releases, we can do exactly the same thing with this architecture. So if we think about this, what we have gained with the microfrontend. So first of all and foremost, microfrontend is not a component. It's a representation of a subdomain that is matching exactly the structure of our organization. It's technology and framework agnostic. As I said, I can develop one microfrontend in one technology and use another one for another microfrontend. Each microfrontend exposes a lifecycle method that is used by the Bootstrap when we want to unload the microfrontend or mount a microfrontend and doing some things inside that. Each team inside the microfrontend can share components, code, style, any other assets, stuff like that, but they cannot do that outside the microfrontend, because that is going to slow down everything. I work in a lot of large organizations, managing hundreds of developers, and when you start to abstract and have a team that is centralizing code, is where the throughput is going nuts. Because you start to have a centralized version of your code, and every time that you need to change, you need to do an additional abstraction. The code became more difficult to maintain, and in 6 months' time, the throughput is gone. Instead, in this way, we can isolate the team. They can they can take their own decision, and they can innovate inside that. The other interesting thing of this, we can test different building systems. One microfrontend could be let's say, built with I don't know, Webpack, another one with Parcel, and so on. So we have let's say, granularity of choice that we can do with microfrontends. This is brilliant. So what we achieved. So first of all, that is for me pretty interesting. We were able to onboard 5 teams in a couple of weeks' time. So after the first week, they were able immediately to contribute to the code base, because they are completely independent. They don't have to wait for understand deeply the architecture. They have like their own single-page application that is really tiny and small. The domain is small. They can understand the domain deeply, and then they can go and start to work on that. We have currently over 100 of developers that are working on the same code base. That is brilliant because also in a distributed way, because we have people in Poland, we have people in London, and we are opening right now a new dev center in Amsterdam. And that is one of the power of this. Finally, the developers have the freedom and responsibility to innovate and owning the code end-to-end, and not just part of that. Because too often, architects are thinking just on the API layer, but it's not the API layer that is the complex one, because currently we have a lot of, let's say, way and patterns and architecture that could help us to scale it up. But for frontend, we don't have much. So if you want to start to look deeply on microfrontends, I picked these two projects. There are many, as I've showed before. You can have like open components. There are other ways to do that, like Tailor.js. But the two things that for me are closer to my mindset are these two frameworks. One is single SPA, that is not well known, but is providing a structure that is very similar to what we have built. Unfortunately, I discovered that too late in the process, like a year after that we started to work on this, but it is a really interesting one. And then Fringe.js. Fringe.js provides a slightly more flexibility and freedom compared to single SPA, but it's still another interesting one. Is leveraging reactive programming behind the scene, and you can create components with different frameworks, and Fringe.js will, let's say, collect them and show them inside their scaffolder. So this is an interesting one as well. In order to wrap up, I would like to just summarize what we have seen till now. So when we scale front-end application, the problem is not scaling the infrastructure, it's scaling the teams. And we have to take in consideration this because it's very, very important to have the right throughput to reduce the communication overhead between teams. Last but not least, often developers are moving from one company to another one, and I don't know how is the industry here, but in London they are changing more or less every year and a half, mainly because they want to try something new. But with microfrontends, you are basically providing them what they are looking for inside the organization, and also it could be a good way to retain people. Last but not least, I'm working right now on, if you're interested to know more about microfrontends, obviously, because in 30 minutes it's very difficult to summarize everything, I'm writing right now a report for O'Reilly that will be a free report, probably will be available by the end of the year. I'm doing some e-learning session. One will be the 18th of October. Online, that is fully free. You can check on my social profile, and hopefully from next year I will be able to dedicate some of my time on writing a full book on microfrontends. That's it for me. I know that we have some time for questions, but if we are not able to speak right now and question anything, I'm around for the whole 2 days. So please feel free to stop me and challenge all the ideas that they share, because as I said at the beginning, it's 2 years work, and we are going to the path, and having a fresh point of view, it could only help. Thank you very much.